Most people have experienced this moment. You are alone, perhaps driving, walking, or standing in the shower, and suddenly your brain begins arguing with someone. You explain your side clearly. You respond to something they said earlier. You deliver the exact words you wish you had spoken at the time. In your mind, the conversation continues. The other person responds. You answer again. The exchange can feel surprisingly detailed, almost like a real interaction unfolding in front of you. But when the moment ends, something becomes obvious. None of it actually happened. The conversation took place entirely inside the mind. Psychologists have long been interested in this strange habit of the brain. Why does the mind create conversations with people who are not present? Why do these imagined arguments sometimes feel more structured than real discussions? The answer lies in how the brain prepares for social interaction, because long before a conversation takes place in the real world, the brain often begins rehearsing it internally. Human beings are deeply social creatures. For thousands of years, survival depended on cooperation within groups. Communication was essential for negotiating resources, solving conflicts, and maintaining trust between individuals. Because of this, the brain developed systems that constantly monitor social situations. These systems pay attention to tone, reactions, status within a group, and potential disagreement. When a disagreement occurs, the brain often continues processing it long after the conversation has ended. An unfinished discussion creates what psychologists sometimes describe as a cognitive loop. The brain senses that something important in the interaction was unresolved. Perhaps a response was incomplete. Perhaps a point was misunderstood. Perhaps the moment ended before the mind could organize a clear reply. When this happens, the brain may begin constructing a simulated conversation. Inside this simulation, the mind experiments with different responses, testing how each one might change the outcome of the interaction. In many ways, the imaginary argument becomes a rehearsal. Imaginary arguments often feel surprisingly structured. The brain assigns roles to each participant in the conversation. One voice represents the self, while the other voice represents the person being imagined. Both sides respond in sequence. This structure happens because the brain is capable of simulating multiple perspectives at the same time. Psychologists refer to this ability as perspective taking. It allows people to imagine how another person might think, react, or respond during an interaction. When the brain creates an imaginary argument, it uses this ability to build a realistic dialogue. The mind predicts what the other person might say and then generates a response. This process can repeat many times. Each response leads to another imagined reply, creating a chain of conversation inside the mind. Even though the other person is not present, the brain continues constructing their side of the exchange, using stored memories of how they usually speak and behave. Another reason these imaginary conversations appear so easily is related to how the brain organizes unfinished thoughts. The mind tends to hold on to situations that feel incomplete. Psychologists sometimes describe this pattern using the idea of the unfinished task effect. When an activity or interaction ends without a clear conclusion, the brain may continue returning to it. A disagreement that ended suddenly can create this sense of incompleteness. Perhaps the conversation was interrupted. Perhaps there was not enough time to respond. The brain treats these moments as open situations that still need to be processed. Imaginary arguments allow the mind to revisit the interaction and explore how it might have unfolded differently. Inside the simulation, the brain can continue the discussion, adjust responses, and test new ways of explaining an idea. Even though the original moment has already passed, the mind behaves as if the conversation is still active somewhere in memory. Another interesting feature of these imagined arguments is how vividly the brain recreates the social environment surrounding the conversation. Even when a person is alone, the mind may reconstruct small details from the original interaction. The tone of someone's voice, the rhythm of their speech, or the expression they had during the moment can all return with surprising clarity. These details help the brain simulate a realistic exchange. Memory systems provide the raw material. The brain draws from previous experiences with that individual, remembering how they typically react in discussions or disagreements. From these stored patterns, the mind predicts what the person might say next. The result is a conversation that feels structured and believable, but this process is not really about reliving the past. Instead, the brain is using memory to model a possible future interaction. The imagined argument becomes a kind of mental testing ground where different responses can be explored without the risks of a real confrontation. Imaginary arguments also reveal something important about how the brain processes social status and reputation. During conversations, people naturally evaluate how their words might influence how others see them. Even small disagreements can carry subtle signals about confidence, intelligence, or authority within a group. Because these signals matter socially, the brain often continues analyzing them after the interaction ends. An imaginary argument gives the mind an opportunity to reorganize what was said. The brain may construct stronger explanations, clearer wording, or more convincing arguments. Inside the simulation, the mind adjusts tone and phrasing, imagining how a different response might have changed the perception of the conversation. In this way, the brain is not only replaying a disagreement, it is experimenting with different ways of presenting ideas. The goal is not necessarily to win the argument. Instead, the brain is refining how thoughts could be communicated more effectively in future discussions. There is also a timing pattern behind when these imaginary arguments tend to appear. They often emerge during quiet or repetitive moments. Activities like showering, driving, walking, or lying in bed provide the brain with long stretches of uninterrupted thought. During these moments, external stimulation becomes minimal. Without new information demanding attention, the brain naturally begins shifting focus inward. Psychologists sometimes describe this mental state as a reflective mode. In reflective mode, the mind reviews experiences, compares past interactions, and evaluates unresolved situations. Social interactions are especially likely to appear during this process because they involve multiple layers of interpretation. Tone of voice, facial expressions, and subtle reactions can all carry meaning. When the brain senses that some part of a conversation was unclear or unresolved, reflective thinking may return to the moment. Imaginary arguments become one way the mind continues exploring what might have been happening beneath the surface of the interaction. Another factor that strengthens imaginary arguments is the brain's natural desire for coherence. Human beings prefer experiences that feel logically complete. When a conversation ends abruptly or leaves important ideas unsaid, the mind may continue searching for a clearer conclusion. Imaginary dialogue allows the brain to organize thoughts in a way that feels more structured. Inside the simulated conversation, arguments become clearer and responses appear more precise. The mind often constructs sentences that sound smoother and more confident than the words that were spoken during the original interaction. This can create the impression that the brain has finally discovered the right response. However, the purpose of this process is not necessarily to correct the past. Instead, the brain is refining how information is organized. It is shaping ideas into forms that could be communicated more clearly if a similar conversation occurs again. Another feature of imaginary arguments is how easily the brain shifts between different versions of the same conversation. In one version, the imagined discussion might remain calm and thoughtful. In another, the tone may become sharper, with stronger responses appearing in the mind. The brain moves through these variations quickly, adjusting the dialogue as if it were testing different outcomes. Psychologists often describe this type of thinking as mental simulation. The brain creates a scenario, observes how it unfolds, and then modifies the conditions to see how the result changes. In the case of imagined arguments, the scenario involves social interaction. Each variation allows the brain to experiment with different ways a conversation might develop. What happens if the response is more direct? What happens if the explanation is more detailed? The mind runs through these possibilities quietly, comparing them. Although the conversation never occurs in reality, the brain treats the simulation as useful information for understanding how future interactions might unfold. Imaginary arguments also highlight how strongly the brain is influenced by emotional signals from past conversations. If an interaction involved frustration, misunderstanding, or disagreement, the emotional tone of that moment can remain active in memory. When the brain revisits the conversation later, those emotional signals often guide how the imagined dialogue unfolds. The mind may replay the moment while adjusting certain details. Words become clearer, timing improves, responses appear more confident. This process can make the imagined version of the conversation feel more satisfying than the original interaction. However, the brain is not simply seeking emotional relief, it is also analyzing the situation. By revisiting the emotional signals connected to the conversation, the mind attempts to understand what caused the tension or confusion in the first place. The imagined argument becomes another way for the brain to examine the emotional structure of the interaction. The brain's ability to simulate conversations also depends heavily on memory. Every interaction a person has contributes small pieces of information about how others communicate. Tone patterns, word choices, and typical reactions all become part of a mental record. When the brain creates an imaginary argument, it draws from this record to construct the other person's responses. The mind predicts how they might react based on how they have behaved in previous conversations. In this way, the imagined dialogue is not entirely invented. It is built from real observations gathered over time. Because these observations are stored across many different memories, the brain can combine them into a believable exchange. The result is a conversation that feels realistic enough to follow naturally. Even though the person being imagined is not present, the brain uses past experiences to approximate how the discussion might unfold. There is also an interesting contrast between how imaginary arguments feel during the moment and how they appear afterward. While the mind is engaged in the simulation, the conversation can feel vivid and absorbing. Thoughts move quickly from one response to the next, creating a sense of active dialogue. But once attention shifts to something else, the imagined conversation often fades almost immediately. This happens because the brain treats the simulation as temporary processing rather than a permanent memory. The purpose of the imagined argument is not to store a new experience. Instead, it allows the mind to reorganize existing information. After the brain finishes exploring the conversation, the simulation dissolves. What remains is the underlying adjustment to how the brain understands the interaction. The mind keeps the insights it gathered but discards most of the imagined dialogue itself. Another interesting aspect of imaginary arguments is how easily the brain assigns certainty to its own imagined responses. Inside the simulation, the mind often presents ideas in a clear and organized way. Sentences flow smoothly, and arguments seem logically complete. This can create the impression that the brain has discovered the perfect explanation or response. However, the clarity inside the imagined conversation partly comes from the fact that the brain controls both sides of the dialogue. When constructing the other person's responses, the mind predicts their reactions using past experience. These predictions are often simplified versions of how the conversation might unfold in reality. Because the brain is guiding both sides of the exchange, the imagined discussion becomes easier to navigate. In real conversations, other people introduce unexpected reactions, interruptions, or misunderstandings. The simulation lacks these unpredictable elements. As a result, imaginary arguments can feel unusually controlled compared to real interactions. Imaginary arguments also demonstrate how the brain continuously refines its understanding of social communication. Every conversation provides feedback about how ideas are received. Sometimes a comment is misunderstood. Sometimes a point is not expressed clearly enough. When the brain senses that a message was incomplete or ineffective, it may return to the moment later. During an imagined conversation, the mind reorganizes the explanation. Words are rearranged, examples become clearer, and the structure of the argument improves. This process resembles how a person might rehearse a presentation or practice explaining a complex idea. The brain tests different ways of expressing the same thought. Over time, these rehearsals strengthen how the idea is stored in memory. If a similar topic appears again in a future conversation, the brain may recall the refined explanation more easily. In this way, imaginary arguments can function as a quiet form of mental rehearsal. Another reason imaginary arguments appear frequently is that the brain constantly attempts to predict future situations. Prediction is one of the mind's most important functions. By anticipating possible events, the brain can prepare responses before they are needed. Social situations are particularly complex, so the mind often runs simulations to explore how they might unfold. An imagined disagreement is one example of this process. The brain constructs a scenario where a similar conversation might happen again. Within that scenario, the mind practices explaining ideas, responding to criticism, or clarifying misunderstandings. Each imagined exchange becomes a small experiment in communication. The brain observes how the conversation develops and adjusts its responses accordingly. Although the situation may never actually occur, the simulation still contributes to the brain's understanding of how social interactions operate. The imagined argument becomes part of the mind's preparation for future conversations. There is also an important difference between imagined conversations and memories of real ones. Real conversations are shaped by many unpredictable elements. Another person's mood, attention, or interpretation of words can change the direction of the discussion. Imaginary arguments remove much of this uncertainty. The brain builds a simplified version of the interaction, where the sequence of responses follows a clear pattern. Because the simulation is more predictable, the mind can focus on analyzing ideas rather than reacting to unexpected changes. This allows the brain to examine the structure of the disagreement itself. What was the central point of conflict? Which part of the explanation caused confusion? By isolating the conversation from its unpredictable surroundings, the brain can study it more carefully. The imagined dialogue becomes a focused space where the mind can examine how the interaction unfolded. Another detail that makes imaginary arguments feel so real is the brain's ability to recreate internal speech. When people think in sentences, many experience a quiet form of inner voice. This voice does not produce sound, yet it follows the rhythm and structure of spoken language. During an imagined argument, this internal speech becomes the medium through which the conversation unfolds. One sentence forms, followed by another reply, and then another response. The mind moves through the dialogue almost as if the words were being spoken aloud. Because internal speech uses the same language systems involved in real conversation, the imagined exchange can feel surprisingly natural. The brain treats the sentences as meaningful communication, even though they remain entirely private. In this way, imaginary arguments rely on the same mental tools that support real dialogue. The only difference is that both sides of the conversation are generated by the same mind. Imaginary arguments also highlight how strongly the brain values understanding the intentions of others. In social situations, people constantly interpret what another person might mean beneath their words. Tone, timing, and expression all influence how a message is understood. When a disagreement occurs, the brain often continues examining these signals long after the conversation ends. An imagined dialogue allows the mind to revisit the interaction and reinterpret what might have been happening. The brain asks quiet questions within the simulation. Did the other person misunderstand the point? Were they reacting emotionally rather than logically? By replaying the conversation with slight adjustments, the mind explores different interpretations of the other person's intentions. This process helps the brain refine its understanding of the interaction. The imagined argument becomes a way of analyzing not only what was said, but also what may have been meant. Another reason these imagined conversations can appear repeatedly is the way memory links similar experiences together. The brain organizes memories in networks based on shared themes. Events involving disagreement, debate, or misunderstanding often become connected within the same network. When the mind begins replaying one imagined argument, it can activate memories of other conversations with similar emotional patterns. A disagreement from last week may lead to another memory from months earlier. The brain moves through these connected moments quickly, comparing them. Each interaction becomes another example of how people respond during disagreement. Over time, the mind gathers patterns from these comparisons. Which explanations were understood easily? Which moments created confusion? Imaginary arguments sometimes return because they belong to this larger network of social learning. The brain revisits them while examining how communication unfolds across many different situations. Despite how detailed these imagined arguments can become, the brain does not treat them as problems that must be solved immediately. Instead, they are part of an ongoing process of organizing social experience. Human interactions are complex, and the mind constantly gathers information about how conversations develop. Imaginary dialogue provides another opportunity to review that information. The brain revisits a conversation, adjusts the wording of an explanation, and explores how a different response might sound. After this exploration, attention eventually moves elsewhere. The imagined argument fades, leaving behind only the subtle adjustments the brain has made to its understanding of the interaction. In this way, the simulation functions less like a conflict and more like a form of quiet analysis. The mind studies the structure of the conversation and then continues processing new experiences. From a psychological perspective, imaginary arguments reveal how active the human mind remains even when no conversation is taking place. The brain rarely stops interpreting social information. It observes how people react, remembers how ideas were received, and compares those moments across many different interactions. When a conversation leaves uncertainty behind, the mind may continue examining it internally. Imagined dialogue becomes one method the brain uses to explore possible explanations. Within the simulation, the mind experiments with different responses and interpretations. These mental exchanges do not require another person to be present. The brain already holds enough information from past experiences to approximate how the discussion might unfold. Through this process, the mind gradually refines how it understands communication. Each imagined argument contributes another small piece to the brain's ongoing effort to interpret social behavior. When viewed from a distance, imaginary arguments become easier to understand. They are not simply random thoughts appearing in the mind. Instead, they are part of the brain's broader system for analyzing social interaction. Conversations shape relationships, reputation, and cooperation between individuals. Because these outcomes matter, the brain continues studying conversations even after they have ended. Imagined dialogue allows the mind to revisit a moment and explore how different responses might have changed the exchange. The simulation is temporary, but the insights gathered from it can influence how future conversations unfold. Over time, these quiet rehearsals help the brain organize ideas, anticipate reactions, and understand patterns in human communication. What appears to be an argument inside the mind is often something else entirely. It is the brain's way of examining how people talk, disagree, and attempt to understand one another.